I was motivated to make this particular entry in my vlog by the news in the last couple of months that Sight and Sound, the British film journal, had updated their list of the greatest films of all time, and that the number one position, after being occupied by Citizen Kane more or less since they started doing the poll back to the 50s, was no longer number one, and that the new number one was Alfred Hitchcock's Vertigo. I actually was almost breathless with stupefaction when I heard that, not because I think that Vertigo is a bad film, but I certainly don't think it's the greatest film ever made. But it does raise an interesting question about the purpose of criticism and what I call the paradox of criticism. Because the Sight and Sound poll has been conducted more or less since about the time that Vertigo was made, and I'd be absolutely 100% certain that when Vertigo came out, no one involved in that poll would have considered it even a candidate for being the greatest film ever made. So what has happened between 1956 and today? Well, has Vertigo become a better film? In a sense, yes, even though it's the same movie that was made back in the 50s. Or is there something else at work here? And I think the answer is yes, and it has to do with the purpose of criticism and the ironies involved. Now, to go to a different list, if you go to the Library of Congress's National Registry of Films, which is something that they add to periodically about films that deserve preservation and are somehow indicative of American culture, I guess. One of the most interesting things about it is if you look at that list of films, first of all, several of them are titles you may never even have heard of, but even leaving that out of it, many of them are titles that when the films were initially released were not particularly well reviewed. And yet now here they are considered national treasures. In terms of my personal history, I think the one that stands out is Blade Runner, because I remember when Blade Runner came out, it was not panned, but it wasn't really received very affectionately by most critics. It was sort of patronized as being visually interesting, but that was about it. And yet, it now is recognized as perhaps one of the most films to come out of Hollywood in the 1980s, incidentally directed by a British director. I don't want to lose sight of that. So the question is, how does this happen? And I think the other question related to it is, what is a critic supposed to do if he or she gets this wrong all the time? Because usually the defense made in favor of criticism, as opposed to just popular reviews, or for that matter, advertising, is that critics, unlike the unwashed public, are interested in the long-term reputation or qualities of a film, so that it's not enough for it to be a popular success. They're evaluating it in terms of some broader sense of quality and importance. Now, if that is the purpose of criticism, and incidentally, I don't necessarily think it is, but if that is the purpose of criticism, it's not going very well if it consistently underrates films that over time are recognized as important. And conversely, if you were to look at some of the reviews of films that were hailed as masterpieces, which today are virtually forgotten. So standards change. Critics don't like to admit this, but standards change. Now, does that mean that criticism has no purpose at all? I don't want to resort to the excesses of relativism that say, well, anything goes, and if it's popular, that's all that matters. Because popularity itself is a highly unreliable gauge of long-term importance. So what does a critic do? Well, paradoxically, I think that even though critics, frankly, more often than not, get it wrong, that their opinions are still valuable as qualitative evaluations of particular films at particular times. By which I mean that when a critic says this or that film is good, it has these interesting qualities, they are speaking to standards that are relevant at the moment that they are writing. And as such, they do provide a reasonable reflection of the quality of the film. And they are perhaps pointing out films that otherwise would be drowned in the din of popular acclaim, or rather drowned by the din of popular acclaim for more mainstream product. Now, that doesn't mean that their opinions long-term are correct, but they are answering to standards that in themselves have a longer validity. So that's one part of it. Another reason why criticism does have value is that unlike popular responses, criticisms, well-reasoned responses to films become a reflection over time of a particular mindset. So that, for example, films that were very well received in the 70s, you can go back to reviews of those films from the 70s to get a sense of the way people were thinking. Now, that in itself is valuable. I have to say it isn't necessarily related that much to the qualitative purpose of film criticism, and yet it does give you an historical perspective that might otherwise be missing, because popularity tells you only that at a particular point in time a film was hugely successful with the public. That's not nothing, but it has to be balanced against the reality, particularly in contemporary films, of how much the popularity is manufactured by advertising, by marketing, by pre-publicity, so that when a big budget film comes out, it really is pretty much pre-sold. So popular success in that sense is really nothing more than a reflection of the amount of promotion that has gone into making it a success. So, having said all that, what is the paradox of criticism? The paradox of criticism is that it's a profession dedicated to a task, first of all, that very few people appreciate or admire, but leaving that out of it, it's dedicated to a task that in effect is impossible. Because on the one hand, it's supposed to be evaluating in terms of relatively universal, relatively long-term senses of quality, and yet at the same time there's no way that the critic really can anticipate what will be valuable. At most, a critic can just be honest with himself or herself and with the public by saying, this is what I get out of it, these are the qualities that I think are important, I think that this has the potential to be a long-term, valuable film that is worth thinking about. And that's about it, but it's not nothing. I will say, however, that Vertigo is not the greatest film ever made.